It's a problem, and I talk in my book about my theory as to why that is. It's a slow kill. It will slowly accumulate in your tissues, and it will increase. You'll get more and more over time as you continue to get exposed. It doesn't all get dumped out through your urine. You accumulate it in your tissues, and it causes a lot of trouble as it grows as it becomes more and more prevalent in your tissues. So you get sicker and sicker over time, but it's a slow kill.
Glyphosate is our talk today. What is it? Are you eating a lot of it? And why should you be concerned? We're going to find out today with the senior research scientist at MIT and author of Toxic Legacy, the one, the only. Dr. Stephanie Seneff is here with us today. Doc, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. I'm delighted.
Before we get into what glyphosate may do to us and whether we should be alarmed, let's start with what exactly is glyphosate? A lot of us may not be familiar yet.
Right, and in fact, I didn't know what glyphosate was either 12, 13 years ago when I first discovered it from a presentation that was given by Professor Don Huber, who's an expert on plant physiology and plant pathology. And he gave a 2-hour lecture on glyphosate, and I didn't know what it was, but I thought, well, this sounds interesting. I was looking for toxic exposures that might be contributing to autism. And I was on the edge of my seat the whole time because he was talking about all these things that glyphosate does, and it linked to my experience about what autism is. And so I really feel like it is the primary cause of the autism epidemic that we're seeing in this country. So glyphosate is the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, and most people know what Roundup is. I'd never used it because I don't like to use toxic chemicals in my yard or in my house, but I was aware of my neighbors did, and it turns out it's actually used really extensively on our food crops to control weeds. It's a great chemical in theory because it's completely harmless to humans according to the maker, which is Monsanto, but it kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it. And the big breakthrough in biotech, in the technology of agriculture, was the discovery that they could engineer plants to be resistant to glyphosate by sticking in a microbial gene into the plant's genome through GMO technology. And they did that in several core crops, and now we've got them all over the country. Huge fields of corn and soy and canola, sugar beets, where you can just spray the glyphosate from the airplane, really, and just spray it all over the crop doesn't die, the weeds all get killed. A very, very efficient way to control weeds. So it's been heralded as a great solution for solving food problem, but the problem is it gets all over the food supply. And it's toxic. It is toxic to humans, contrary to what they say.
Now let's talk about that. You read my mind. So it is toxic to humans, yet the official stance is that it's safe for humans. So what's the disconnect? What's being said officially versus the facts that you've been able to sniff out?
Right, and I think it really has to do with the rules that they set when they did the experiments to verify that it was safe. And they set some really interesting rules and followed those rules, and they restricted them from finding the toxicity. And I think that the people who were doing the studies from Monsanto and other people who were in the industry and wanted to get this to pass the process of regulation decided that you only have to look at animal toxicity studies with, like mice, for example. You only have to expose them to the toxin for 3 months, and if you don't see any evidence of harm at the end of 3 months, you can quit. That's fine. You can declare victory. And the other thing is, if you expose them to high levels of a toxin and they look okay, then you don't have to expose them to lower levels. It's kind of like the dose makes the poison. That's also not true for glyphosate, and that's not true for any of the chemicals that are called endocrine disruptors. They all are much more toxic at very low doses, and they knew not to look there because I suspect they knew they would find toxicity, so they just set up rules to avoid it. And Seralini was, after I heard Professor Don Huber give a presentation, shortly after that I went back home and looked up Professor Seralini's paper that had come out very recently, where he had studied mice, and he used the same experiment that Monsanto had used to verify that it was safe, only he didn't stop at 3 months. He used low dose glyphosate. 3 months, everything's fine. 4 months, you start to see problems. By the end of their lifespan, these mice had massive mammary tumors, the females, and the males had kidney damage and liver damage. All of them had reproductive issues, and they had shortened lifespan. So they didn't see the evidence until much later. The other thing they did was to look at the chemical only in isolation. But when they made the formulations, they put in other things that made it much more toxic, much more able to get into the cells. And also, those other things were toxic in and of themselves. And Seralini also showed those results as well, that the extra stuff that's in there that they didn't test, didn't evaluate for safety, is itself toxic, and it makes it much easier for glyphosate to do its nasty effects on the cell. So they basically slipped through the regulatory process by slippery design of their studies so that they wouldn't see the toxicity that was there.
I just want to make sure that I understand what it is that you just said here regarding the how long these studies lasted. These safety studies that they're citing here, they only lasted 3 months. Am I?
Well, the industry decided around that time when they were evaluating glyphosate, I believe, they decided that they set up a rule that if you don't see any toxicity after 3 months of exposure to an animal, you can declare victory. Like, this thing is not toxic. They think it should show up within 3 months. The problem with glyphosate is that it's a slow kill. And I talk in my book about my theory as to why that is. It's a slow kill. It will slowly accumulate in your tissues, and it will increase. You'll get more and more over time as you continue to get exposed. It doesn't all get dumped out through your urine. You accumulate it in your tissues, and it causes a lot of trouble as it grows and as it becomes more and more prevalent in your tissues. So you get sicker and sicker over time, but it's a slow kill.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this 3 months. I mean, because whether you're studying a mouse or something else, 3 months just does not seem like a very long time. Again, not being a doctor myself, but don't we have studies looking at other chemical exposure showing that a lot of this stuff is the wear and tear, the damage that's done is an accumulation over time.
That's
definitely more time than the 3 months.
Right. And you know, cancer takes a long time to develop. It's a whole process of immune system disruption that eventually gets you to a point where you develop cancer, but that doesn't happen right away. And so there are so many chemicals that we're exposed to that are contributing to the problems in our immune system that end up causing cancer. And we had this war on cancer declared by Nixon way back when, and we have not done nothing in that war. We have been set back quite a bit because now we have more cancer than ever. You know, we just have so many chemicals that we're exposed to. It's very hard to stay healthy in the modern world.
All right, let's talk about the widespread usage of glyphosate. How many crops, in your estimation, would you say it's sprayed on?
Well, I don't know how many, but I can name which ones, and it's really a lot of the crops that go into the processed food industry. The ones that have the GMO resistance gene, they can get sprayed all throughout the season, and they don't die, which is very convenient. So they are corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, and also cotton. We even have cottonseed oil that comes from cotton. So any food products derived from those are going to have glyphosate in them because it's used to control the weeds. But then there's a whole other set. You know, people think, oh, non-GMO, that's safe. That's not true, because there's another set of crops that are also very common that are sprayed right before the harvest, and that includes wheat and barley and rye and the garbanzo beans, chickpeas. So hummus, for example, usually has high levels of glyphosate if it's not organic. So those, and then some of the seed oils. So all of these crops are sprayed right before the harvest as a desiccant. So they end up with actually higher levels on average of contamination than the GMO crops. So non-GMO can be a really bad idea if it's not organic. So you really have to look for the certified organic label, and thank God we have that in this country. And certified organic food is becoming more and more available over time. I've seen it in my lifetime because I've been purchasing at the grocery store only certified organic for like 12 years now. And I've seen it become more and more available in the more common grocery stores. Here in Hawaii, I'm in Hawaii, and we have small grocery stores that offer lots of certified organic foods, but even the main grocery stores have a lot of choices that are certified organic, more and more over time.
Well, first of all, you broke my heart mentioning hummus there. That's a dagger. I think for a lot of people who eat the plant-based diet are just a fan of dips. I mean, they go gaga over some hummus, so I might have to make some adjustments there, maybe make my own.
Certified organic, you can get it, and I like hummus too, and I was so sad when I learned that it had all this glyphosate in it. So I don't order it at the restaurant unless I know it's organic, and I can buy it at the grocery store, certified organic hummus.
Well, that's great. I'm definitely going to be looking forward to that. But that list of crops, the primary list of crops that you rattled off, there's a lot on there, and then you got into the wheat, which, I mean, again, then that leads me to believe that anytime we eat a breakfast cereal that's there, if somebody is a fan of drinking beer while watching a game, guess what? There's a chance that that's going to have glyphosate
High
in
chance,
it.
Actually. The Germans did a evaluation of all these different German beers, and they all had glyphosate in them, all of them. And also the wines. Jen Honeycutt, who's a friend of mine, she founded the organization Moms Across America. She tested a whole bunch of California wines, and she found glyphosate in all of them. So they're using it to control the weeds in the vineyards. But they're not GMO. They're just careful to put it on the weeds and not on the plant. But still, the plant takes it up through the roots, and it gets into the wine.
And that is staggering. If there is, let's say, and I believe that we've seen this in some documentaries. Let's say that there are two farmers. One farm is using glyphosate, the other is an organic farm. What are the odds, because of their close proximity, there might be some cross-contamination?
Well, that's the thing. In fact, Zen looked at biodynamic wines, which are supposed to be even better than organic, and they also had glyphosate, much lower levels, but it still was present. So I think you're right. You can't put a fence around your yard and tell the glyphosate not to come in. When you're spraying it from the airplane, it's going to spill over from the wind, it's going to get on your crops. So you can't use it unless you're cheating in organic, but you can certainly end up with it. It's also in the rain, so you're going to find it on your crop when it rains. And if your crop, you have to have gone through many years of nobody using glyphosate on your soil to have it not be in your soil, because it's been accumulating every year. In Brazil, there was a study that looked at an area where they had GMO crops for many years, and each year they found more glyphosate in the soil than the year before. So it's not getting fully broken down over the course of a year. And that's another thing that's different from what they said, because Monsanto claims that it goes away quickly. Within a couple of weeks, it's pretty much consumed by, the sunlight, and the microbes in the soil can break it down, and it's gone. But that is not true in all soil types. So you can end up with it. In fact, there was a study in Canada on trees that had been sprayed with glyphosate 12 years before, and those trees had glyphosate still in their tissues. When they took the samples from the trees, they still had glyphosate contamination 12 years later.
So you're saying something that is actually quite alarming, in that, we're taught that if you buy produce at the store, you bring it home, you wash it to get all of the pesticides off of it. But if something is actually coming into the fruit or in the vegetable through its roots, you can't scrub that out. It's inside already.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think that's what's happening with us as well. We're accumulating in our tissues. And in fact, my friend Anthony Samsel has tested a lot of interesting samples from animals. He tested horses' hooves from a horse that died from founder. Founder is a condition where the hoof is not healthy. And the hoof had a lot of glyphosate in it, of the horse. And he's tested a sample of breast cancer. A sample of breast tissue from a breast cancer patient had glyphosate in it. So it's really in our tissues. It's in the horse's tissues. It's in everybody's tissues.
Let's talk about the conditions here to be really concerned about when it comes to glyphosate. You've already mentioned cancer. I know that you've looked extensively at autism as well. I mean, how many different diseases have been connected to this?
There's a huge list, and one of the things that I did for many years, I worked with Nancy Swanson, she was a great collaborator. We were digging through statistical analyses of frequencies of different diseases and conditions over time, and plotting them against the rise in the use of glyphosate over time, and it's really striking. And Nancy she started with a paper before she met me. Well, she had been working on that material. She had seen all these data that showed increasing prevalence of all these different conditions and diseases that were exactly matched to the rise, because as they introduced the GMO crops in the late 1990s, they started using glyphosate on those, and actually weeds became more resistant, so they had to use more to keep the weeds in control over time. So the usage went up exponentially over the period 2000 to 2010. And then you look at all these diseases. Obesity is a good example, because we have a very obese population, and we keep getting fatter and fatter every year. And I think glyphosate is the primary cause of our obesity epidemic. And you see around the world, countries, when they adopt a Western diet, they start getting fat. In Africa, it's quite striking, because South Africa and then the Mediterranean coast is where you have a very big dichotomy between the middle countries of Africa, which have low obesity, very low obesity prevalence, and then South Africa and the Mediterranean coast, where they have high obesity, and that correlates with with eating foods that contain glyphosate. So obesity, of course, is one. Then diabetes, which is also an epidemic, Alzheimer's disease, autism, thyroid cancer, pancreatic cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease. I mean, that's a start. Parkinson's disease. I mean, there's a lot. They're all going up exactly in step. And of course, autism is perfect match.
That is definitely an extensive list. I'm curious, though, specific to obesity. That's one that's kind of near and dear to my heart in particular. What is the mechanism, in your opinion, that from glyphosate that causes obesity? Is it like just changing us internally, or what's happening there?
Yeah, I think it's just disrupting the digestion of fats and causing us to stuff fat into fat cells, because we have trouble digesting it. And it's, these things are all very complicated. It's connected to the diabetes, of course, as well, because obesity and diabetes are connected. Glyphosate disrupts enzymes in the liver that are needed to make bile acids, and bile acids are needed to digest fats. And so if you can't digest the fats in the gut, you end up parking them in fat cells and storing them there. And then the other interesting thing I believe is true is that it causes it hard for the fat cells to get rid of their fat. It disrupts their ability to release the fat from the fat cells. So it basically gets trapped in the fat cells as an inaccessible source of nutrition. And you can go on a starvation diet, like you can go just stop eating and then you can lose weight. And in part that's good because you've stopped eating glyphosate. So you reduce the exposure to glyphosate, you get those things working again, and you're able to digest those fats, and so you can shrink it down by starving yourself, which is not going to work long term, but
definitely not. But let's try to connect those dots. So we're talking about eating, in particular here in this country, the standard American diet, which is, processed foods, lots of fat, lots of salt, lots of nights at the drive-through, fast food, pizza, all of that good stuff. And you would say, well, it is the fat, it is the calories that's making us obese. But then thinking back to Doc, what you said a little bit earlier in terms of what foods actually have this, the raw ingredients, those ingredients are used in virtually all of those heavily processed foods that contain glyphosate.
That's right. If you eat a processed food diet, you're eating more glyphosate almost for sure, even if you're not choosing organic when you buy your groceries that are fresh, like broccoli and spinach and, whole foods as opposed to soy protein bar, for example. Really important not to eat those processed foods. And of course, those processed foods also miss a lot of important ingredients. Plants have all kinds of interesting polyphenols and flavonoids, really rich, complicated molecules that are very supportive of your health. Plants, are really healthy if you eat the whole plant. But when you take out the basic food groups of fat and carbs and proteins, you're missing a huge number of really interesting molecules that are almost like drugs, like natural drugs, these complex molecules, like herbal medicine type of thing. And herbs, of course, are especially healthy. They're concentrated levels of these special nutrients that the plants provide that are going to help with antioxidant, protecting your liver from damage, for example, so it can work better, because like glyphosate causes oxidative damage, as do many other chemicals in the liver, which interferes with its ability to do its job. And the liver has an enormous responsibility in the body to keep it healthy.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And I'm wondering, again, though, with it being in so many different foods, even in the drinks that we consume, is it possible to even quantify the number of times the typical person is exposed to glyphosate on a daily basis?
I think it's inevitable that you're going to get exposed to it, even if you're being careful to avoid it. It's in the rain. Anthony Samsel, again, my friend who's been sampling all kinds of things, he's asked people, different parts of the world, to catch rain. When it rained, catch the rainwater and send it to him, and he would test it for glyphosate. And I caught the rainwater in 3 places, sent him 3 samples, one here in Hawaii, which is in Kauai, very low population, one in my home in Winchester, Massachusetts, and one in Cambridge, where my office it was at MIT. And the Cambridge sample came out positive for glyphosate, and the other 2 were negative. I think it's showing up in the rainwater anywhere where there's high population. I think it's actually getting into the biofuels. This is something I've talked about recently. Biofuels are a growing industry that's trying to get around the consumption of fossil fuels, where you take crops, for example, you have a crop, you harvest the crop, and then you take the rubble and you ship it on a barge down to a major city, and you send it into a plant where it gets turned into biofuel. That can be biodiesel, bioethanol. We have 10% ethanol in our gasoline these days, I think, or the new law, I think, is 10%. It used to be 5%. Ethanol likely, that bioethanol likely contains glyphosate because it's harvested from crops that are either sprayed right before harvest or they're GMO, like GMO corn. A lot of the ethanol comes from GMO corn. And so then I think it's escaping into the air, especially in the cities where you've got a lot of these biodiesel trucks and bioethanol in the cars. I mean, just so much traffic releasing glyphosate evaporating before it reaches combustion. I think that's and even at the gas station, escaping at the gas station, I think that's a big problem. And that's why I think it's showing up in the rain when you collect it in the city.
For sure. So you think that for it to get into the atmosphere like that, it would be escaping before you said it gets to combustion. So that would be the little drops at the gas station that don't quite make it into the tank. Maybe you've got a fuel line.
Yeah, you smell gasoline when you're getting your gas a lot, right? When you're filling your tank, you can smell the gasoline. It's evaporating. And I think the glyphosate is evaporating with it.
Does it then, if it does reach the combustion process, does it just burn off at that point?
Combustion will pretty much wipe it out for sure. The temperature is high enough to destroy it. In fact, it's really hard to break down glyphosate. That's one of the problems. Sunlight will break it down over time, and there are microbes that can break it down, and many of them are pathogens. That's one thing I'm concerned about, certain pathogens that are becoming problematic. Aspergillus is a fungus, that can cause fungal disease, in fact, in the crops even. And Aspergillus is one of the few species that can break down glyphosate. Glyphosate has what's called a CP bond, carbon-phosphorus bond. That's quite unusual in biology. And most species are stumped by it. They don't know how to break that apart. But there are a few versatile microbes that can break it down. And Aspergillus is one. Also, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is another species that's been causing trouble in hospitals. People get infected. They come in for a minor operation. They get infected with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and it can kill them. So these pathogens are doing a service for the host by removing the glyphosate, but at the same time, they're causing symptoms of disease. And I think that's a lot of what we see with microbes, is that often they're actually helpful in some way, which is why they're surviving. But then they release toxic metabolites, they cause problems. So you don't get it both ways. You either get rid of the glyphosate and have a problem with the bug, or you don't get rid of the glyphosate and then you've got a problem with the glyphosate. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and you used the word microbe a couple of times there with that answer, and it immediately takes me back to what it was you were talking about, causing trouble for the digestive tract. Microbes and digestion, they're kind of synonymous with one another in terms of gut health. What are some of the conditions that you're aware of, talking about digestive ailments, that glyphosate has been associated with?
I mentioned inflammatory bowel disease. Definitely, I think that one is being caused. And it makes sense because glyphosate, so I've studied glyphosate in microbes, and it's interesting because certain microbes are more sensitive to glyphosate than others. And a study was done on the chicken microbiome, and they found that two species, lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, were very sensitive to glyphosate. So they get killed off. Those are two major species in your gut that the baby depends on the lactobacillus to drink the milk. So it's really important. And bifidobacteria do a lot of good things for the host. They both become smaller populations because they're being killed off by glyphosate. And that's where you allow the pathogens to gain control. Pathogens like Clostridia species, and even yeast overgrowth, all these kinds of problems that we see are, I think, connected to glyphosate killing off the beneficial microbes and allowing the pathogens. And as I mentioned, pathogens that can break down glyphosate are going to have an advantage because they're not going to be poisoned by it. They can remove it. They're doing themselves a service, but also helping out to get rid of the glyphosate in the host. So yeah, you get these imbalances. And of course, celiac disease is one I've written a paper about together with Anthony Samsel. I believe that glyphosate is the primary cause of the epidemic we're seeing in celiac disease. I didn't know anybody who had gluten intolerance when I was a kid. It wasn't something that was on the radar screen at all.
Didn't get
that was a long time ago, but now it's like you got to ask everybody coming to dinner, do you have gluten intolerance? I mean, you have to find out, and you have to make sure to keep gluten out of your menu when you bring them over for dinner, because there's so many people are allergic to gluten these days. And celiac disease is, of course, it has a genetic aspect to it, or it has a specific definition of antibodies to a particular protein. But lots of people have gluten intolerance without actually having celiac disease. These days, they can't eat wheat. And I think it's because the wheat's sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. It's been shown that there's high levels of wheat and high levels of glyphosate in wheat-based foods. And the glyphosate is, I think, actually by virtue of disrupting the bifidobacteria. I think it's the lactobacillus that have several different enzymes that help to break down gluten. Gluten has a lot of proline, and proline is a difficult amino acid to break down, to break it apart from its neighbors. And the microbes provide special enzymes that help the host to break down the gluten. But the microbes get poisoned by the glyphosate, and then the gluten doesn't get broken down. And now you have these peptides that are strings of amino acids that then become allergenic because the immune cells react to these foreign peptides that get loose into the body. Glyphosate induces a leaky gut as well, so that these peptides can get out into the circulation. And that's when the immune system gets very upset and it develops antibodies to those foreign proteins.
So it's clear once it gets into your system that it can really get in there and do a lot of damage. But you're talking specifically about celiac disease, and I'm thinking about one particular breakfast cereal which very much makes a name for itself, being celiac friendly and gluten free. Maybe the most popular breakfast cereal of all, and that is Cheerios, but clearly that is going to have glyphosate in it, is it?
High levels, yes. That Cheerios is one of the things I think that was tested by one of the advocacy groups. Then they found high levels of glyphosate in the Cheerios, which is really sad because that's such a good children's food. The little kid picks it up off the tray, the high chair, it's a finger food that they love.
I wonder, there has to be like organic knockoff, right? Organic O's or
Oh,
something
there
like
is.
that.
There is, absolutely. I actually like Cheerios, and I buy an organic version of it. So you can get that organic, and you really should. If you've got kids, absolutely switch to organic Cheerios. And of course, also the cookies, like Oreo cookies is another favorite. And there's an organic Oreo cookie lookalike that probably doesn't taste quite as good because they can't put some of those synthetic flavors in there as well. But definitely want to switch to organic Oreo cookie lookalikes because they had high levels of glyphosate. A lot of these, and also like goldfish crackers. I mean, a lot of these foods that the kids really love, the processed foods that the kids love, they are loaded with glyphosate. That's, I think, a reason why we have such a problem with our children, so many different health problems with our children. Allergies, food allergies and autism and ADHD. I mean, just such a huge list. Those are all, I think, connected to glyphosate.
And let's talk about autism here for a moment, because that's one of the things that really kind of puts you on the map with a lot of people in terms of glyphosate ingestion and its link to disease. What do we know about the connection between the two there in particular?
Very interesting. And in fact, I was studying autism first. I started looking at autism in 2007, and I figured there had to be something that they were getting exposed to that was going up over time. So I was looking for different possibilities, and I didn't think of glyphosate at all, to be honest with you. I was looking at other things. Glyphosate was safe. I didn't think it could be the problem until I heard Professor Don Huber's 2-hour presentation. What I had figured out was that autism was connected to a sulfation problem. I learned that from Rosemary Waring was a researcher she was treating several different, I think over 100 different autistic kids, and she wrote papers and she analyzed their urine to look at what metabolites in their urine that might be out of whack compared to other kids, to looking for ways to explain what was going on metabolically. And one thing she found really striking was that they had very high levels of metabolites that weren't sulfate, but they were things like sulfate. They were like thiosulfate and sulfite, very high levels of those things in their urine. So she was suspecting that they had trouble with the sulfation pathways. They couldn't make sulfate, and they couldn't attach sulfate to things and ship it around. And it turns out that's absolutely central. I think it's central to autism, probably plays a role in Alzheimer's disease, and probably many other things as well. I think it may be central to glyphosate's toxicity even, because I believe that glyphosate is disrupting the sulfation pathways, and it starts in the gut. And in fact, remarkably, there was a paper on autism that came out just a couple of years ago, and I already had this theory that autistic kids had trouble with sulfation pathways. This paper was great because it showed in the gut, in the blood, and in the brain, it showed defects, very suppressed activity of enzymes that add sulfate to other molecules. And so there's lots of different important things that happen with this ability to add sulfate to things that is central to distributing nutrients across the body and to detoxify toxic exposures. And so, for example, Clostridia species produce metabolites that are very toxic to the brain. And the way those metabolites are treated by the liver is to add a sulfate to them, which makes them water soluble. And then you can put them out into the blood. They can go to the urine and they can be secreted. If you can't stick the sulfate on there, they're not water soluble and they can't be shipped that way. And then they become problematic. They become toxic. And there are other things like neurotransmitters, like serotonin, melatonin, the thyroid hormone, dopamine. All of those are sulfated in transit. So they're made somewhere, a sulfate is stuck onto them. The sulfate makes them water soluble. They go into the blood. They go to the place wherever they're going. They take the sulfate off, and now they can be delivered and used by the recipient cell. And the sulfate can also be used. So they're both transporting sulfate and becoming water soluble because of the sulfate that's attached to them. And if these molecules can't do that, then you've got all kinds of problems. And that's what you see with autism. Autism has severe deficiency in heparan sulfate, which is a sulfated polysugar compound. Autistic kids have a severe deficiency in that in the brain ventricles. Both the children and the mice. They looked at mice as well that have a kind of an autistic-like syndrome. Same problem. And that's, again, because the sulfation pathways are broken. So I think sulfate is also super important in the blood. It's in the red blood cells. It's in the aligning all the vessels of the blood, and it plays a really important role in keeping the blood healthy.
I don't think it would be fair to say the exclusive cause of autism is glyphosate, but I am curious if you could tell us what we have seen in terms of the rate of autism, in terms of the rise in the usage of glyphosate over the years. What kind of correlation have you been able to draw?
It's a perfect match. It's like a 0.99 correlation coefficient between autism in first grade in the United States and the use of glyphosate over the previous 4 years integrated. So you're looking at the previous 4 years of glyphosate usage on core crops and the rate of autism in first grade. They're perfect match, coincide over the period from like 2000 or even earlier than that, but maybe mostly 2000 to 2010, which is where we had the data on glyphosate.
Right. So, I mean, are we at a point now, because it is so widely used, that we're pretty well, like, we're doomed here? I mean,
yeah, I think we're screwed.
Yeah, that's the word. You said it. I was trying to.
So I hesitate to use that word.
Yeah, no, I got you. I think we're in big trouble. And the other thing that's really worrisome is that there have been recent studies that have shown this. They didn't realize that glyphosate's an endocrine disruptor, but now people are becoming aware of that, and people are doing studies where they expose pregnant mice to low doses of glyphosate during a critical period of pregnancy that they know about experimentally from other kinds of toxins. That if you expose the animal to glyphosate during this critical period of development, it can have a huge effect, what's called a transgenerational effect, that it's the germline cells that note that exposure, remember it, and change their epigenetics. It's called epigenetic effect, which is not to change the genome, but to change other things that are going on with the genome. These are all very complicated aspects of biology that are involved in policy of the cells. And so you find the pregnant rat is fine, doesn't look like it has any problem with that glyphosate exposure. The offspring appear to be fine. They grow up and they start to have offspring, and then you get to the next generation and things get worse and worse. It's early birth, so the premature birth, problems of dying during birth, and then various kinds of metabolic conditions like obesity and diabetes, and then worse in the third generation. So like if your grandmother was exposed in utero, you can have effects from that, even if there was never any other exposure all the way through that time period. You can have a nasty effect from what happened to your grandmother when she was pregnant. That just
even
does
your
not
great
seem
grandmother
fair.
when she was pregnant. It's really scary because now we've got second generation kids showing up now, and things are getting a lot worse. I mean, the children in this generation are really sick. They've got over 50% have some kind of major health problem, autoimmune disease. We have even like the ticks. They have problems with that, and ADHD is an epidemic, and of course autism is now like 1 in 36 last I heard. Absolutely unbelievable, the number of kids, and there's 4 times as many boys as girls, so things are looking really, really troubling for the boys.
Do we have any idea as to why this seems to be a little bit more dangerous for males than females?
A lot more dangerous for males, and I have certainly an idea why, and I think it has to do with testosterone, because testosterone, of course, the boys have a lot more testosterone than the girls do. They naturally produce estrogen, and testosterone actually gets converted to estrogen by an enzyme called aromatase, and that enzyme is a member of a class of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, and glyphosate has been shown to disrupt these enzymes in the liver, and glyphosate has even been shown experimentally to disrupt aromatase, that specific enzyme, in studies. And so what happens is it's basically too much testosterone in utero during development when you're in the womb, overexposure to testosterone and not enough estrogen, so a kind of hypertestosterone exposure during development that then causes this brain problem because of not enough estrogen in the brain. And interestingly, there's actually a study, another recent study that came out. There have been a lot of good studies showing up in the last few years. I think people are finally realizing this stuff is toxic. This study involved pregnant women. They tested their level of glyphosate during pregnancy, and then they have a metric that they use for girl babies, not boy babies, but girl babies, that can test whether they were exposed to testosterone in utero. It's a well-known effect that if there's too much testosterone for a girl, she ends up with this metric of this, what's called the anogenital distance, that you can imagine what that might be. That's too long. It's longer if you've had more testosterone and shorter if you've had less. And they found a very strong correlation statistically between the level of glyphosate in the mother's urine and this metric that they use on the girl babies. This metric is first of all, it's an indicator that you've had too much testosterone exposure in utero, and it's also a predictor of a condition called polycystic ovary syndrome. You have a much higher risk of that condition as you grow up if you have this metric at birth. And that syndrome causes infertility. It's the biggest cause of infertility in the females, is this polycystic ovary syndrome, along with other problems. And it's also highly correlated with autism and highly correlated with producing an autistic child. So that all connects together. And that's an effect on the girl side, the polycystic ovary syndrome, which disrupts their reproductive capacity. It's also very dangerous for sperm, and there have been studies on sperm that have shown that glyphosate causes a reduction in the count and a reduction in the motility of the sperm. They become less mobile. And both of those are going to be really bad news for the male. So I think we're going to have, I'm imagining in the next generation, there's going to be two problems that are going to reduce their fertility rate. One is just the toxic exposures that they're getting from all kinds of sources, but particularly glyphosate in my case. And then two is going to be this concern about autism rates being through the roof and a worry that they're going to have an autistic child, or even some of these other conditions that are really serious, to make them decide, to cognitively decide, I'm not going to have kids. It's just too much risk for something that's going to really, change my entire life plan in a way I don't want to go there. So I really think we're going to have a population implosion in the next generation.
We've been talking a lot about the risk of these diseases, the health challenges that are presented for the average person, for you and for me. But I'm wondering, what about the farmers who are way more heavily exposed to glyphosate than you or I? What do we know about the health challenges that they have been facing?
Yeah, I know of at least two things that have been pretty much shown in experimental studies with the farmers. One is Parkinson's disease, and the other one is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And of course, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is also much higher risk for that if you have celiac disease. And that's actually the primary reason why people with celiac tend to die young. That's all connected to glyphosate. And I think that there's been a lot of lawsuits that have come out with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in particular. And there were three. The first one was Dwayne Lee Johnson in California. He was he took care of the grounds of the schools, public schools, and he used only glyphosate. He used glyphosate to control the weeds. And he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in his early 40s. He had young children, and he took a lawsuit against Monsanto and won a really big victory. That was the first time that a lawsuit was successful against Monsanto for accusation of their product causing a disease. And he got a large settlement from the jury trial, which was later reduced by the judge, and then Monsanto, of course, took it to higher levels. So you've got to really have a stomach for it if you go after Monsanto with a lawsuit. But that triggered a whole bunch of other lawsuits. And there were two more that were successful. And none of these involved farmers. And the reason for that is because farmers are exposed to so many things that you can't nail it down to be just glyphosate. They'll always point to the other exposure and say, no, that's the reason why you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But there was a study done on farmers, and they looked at all the different chemicals they were exposed to, and each one individually, what was their correlation with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then they were able to kind of correct for what else was present when they were exposed and come around to the second round of numbers. And when they did that, everything else went down in their prediction and glyphosate went up. In other words, all those pointed to glyphosate as being the real culprit associated with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that was blamed on the other chemical exposure. So it's hard to do the experiment with farmers. People know that farmers suffer from increased risk to Parkinson's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, certainly those two, probably other things as well, but I think those two have really stood out and studies have been done. But they have so many toxic exposures that there's probably synergistic toxicity among all the different things. There's also kidney failure, which definitely points to glyphosate. I've written papers on that. Sugarcane farmers in Central America are dying young of kidney failure in their 40s, and they can't figure out what's going on. And of course, the funding usually comes from the agrochemical industry, so that they can't find glyphosate as the answer. But it's very clear to me, and I've written more than one. I think I've written 3 papers now linking glyphosate to kidney failure in the sugarcane farmers who spray glyphosate right before harvest, and then they harvest it. They get really hands-on with the machete to harvest the sugarcane, and they're getting a lot of exposure to glyphosate at the harvest, and it's killing their kidneys.
Boy, I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface in terms of what this stuff can do with our own health. But I also want to ask you, as long as you're here, about what impact glyphosate may be having on the environment as well. I mean, you have to be living under a rock to know that the majority of the world is dealing with record heat. We've got rising tides. We've got the threat of Gulf streams, jet streams, just kind of going away because of climate change. Is there any connection with glyphosate in that arena as well?
I believe so, and I believe it's an overlooked factor. People are aware that agriculture could be contributing to climate change, but I think specifically glyphosate. And one thing really interesting to me is that there's an enzyme called rubisco. Rubisco stands for 3 words, ru, bis, and co, but I won't tell you what those words are, but the nickname is rubisco. This enzyme is the most common enzyme on the planet. All the plants have it, and animals don't have it at all. It's a really interesting enzyme, and it plays a critical role in photosynthesis. And what that does is it traps carbon from the air and ultimately puts it into the soil. So this whole process of plants grabbing carbon out of the air, putting it into the soil, is a crucial part of removing carbon dioxide from the air. And carbon dioxide, of course, is a major factor in global climate change. The other thing is the nitrogen. And in fact, glyphosate disrupts the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that allow the plants to take up nitrogen. Plants essentially need nitrogen as a nutrient to be able to live. And they apply all these nitrate fertilizers to the crops. And when the crops are exposed to glyphosate, they have to apply more nitrate fertilizers because of the inefficiency in getting the nitrate into the crop. And those nitrate fertilizers then get washed off with the rain into the waterways. And then that causes, this overgrowth of algae, and it causes the sunlight can't filter through, and the oxygen gets consumed by these, algae and whatnot that are growing in this sort of hyper nutritious nutrient supplied, both phosphate and nitrate. Glyphosate actually provides phosphate because it has a phosphorus in it. It provides phosphate to the waterways, and the phosphate and nitrate together can cause problems with overgrowth of cyanobacteria, which cause a lot of problems in the waterways. But then the other problem is nitrous oxide, which ends up, when you get down into a reducing environment, nitrous oxide gets released from the waterways. And that nitrous oxide is 100 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of climate change. So I think the combination of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the rubisco, all three of those are going to contribute to climate change. I believe glyphosate may be the most important factor in climate change, and you don't hear anything about that. In fact, I remember I have notes here on phosphorus because there was a study, the percentage of streams in the United States uncontaminated by phosphate. So those that, when you looked at the stream, there was no phosphate, it decreased from 25% in 2004 to 10% 5 years later, and then to only 1.6% another 10 years later. So dramatic drop in the number of streams that don't have free phosphate in them. Glyphosate is a major supplier, I think, of the phosphate and the nitrate that are providing nutrition to overgrow the algae called blue-green algae. You have a whole bunch of problems with the waterways because of these too many nutrients in the waterways.
Well, Doc, I think the two of us have spent the last 45 minutes or so painting an awfully bleak picture. So let's try to end this with a little bit of hope. Somebody's like waving the white towel right now, or the white flag, and they're just like, I'm throwing my hands up. I don't know what to do. What are some tips? What are some things that the average person can do to try to limit their exposure? You mentioned eating organic earlier.
Absolutely essential, certified organic. And I also say eating sulfur-containing foods. The sulfate problem. You fix the glyphosate exposure, and then you make sure to get enough sulfur. Glyphosate depletes the sulfur supply in the foods because it interferes with sulfur uptake, but it also messes up your sulfur system. And so you need to get rid of the glyphosate and then eat foods that are rich in sulfur. There's a lot of good foods. I love the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and Brussels sprouts. I think they're all delicious. And also garlic. I love garlic. We use tons of garlic in cooking, and onions. Those are all good sources of sulfur. So eating a lot of sulfur-containing foods, eating a lot of probiotics, so fermented foods like kombucha and even apple cider vinegar. Vinegar may contain a microbe that can break down glyphosate, and that can be very healthy for your gut to get vinegar. Or any of the sauerkraut is another one that I recommend. Fermented foods. And then I recommend sunlight exposure. I'm very big on sunlight exposure. I believe that sunlight actually catalyzes the synthesis of sulfate in your skin, and it acts as a battery to actually it's like a source of energy for the body. I mean, I think it's ridiculous to think that animals haven't also evolved an essential need for the sunlight just as the plants have. And so I'm a big fan of sunlight. Of course, it gives you the vitamin D as well. And let's see what else. I use Epsom salt baths regularly. Just throw a little bit of Epsom salts into the hot bath water and soak. That's got magnesium sulfate, and both magnesium and sulfate are very important for your health. Eating a lot of fresh vegetables, I mentioned that already, and herbs and spices. Be generous in herbs and spices in your cooking. They've got a lot of interesting metabolites that can be very helpful for improving your mitochondrial health. So I do all of those things. And of course, certified organic, I think, is the most important thing. Eat certified organic food. Also, I want to say about what can you use instead of glyphosate. And I talked to a guy who's an organic farmer, and he told me what he uses. And I knew about this generically, but he gave me a specific formula, which I will give you as a weed killer. An organic weed killer. It's pretty easy. You can make it in your own kitchen. It's 1 cup of salt, a tablespoon of soap, dish soap, dishwasher soap, and a gallon of vinegar. So vinegar, salt, and soap. mix those together, and you can make your own herbicide, and you can use it on the weeds if you're trying to grow a garden. I recommend that. And then grow your own food. I really think we need to get back to gardens at home. Whatever plot of land you've got, put your favorite foods there and grow those crops and eat your own food. I think that's got to happen as a revolution across the country. We need to take charge of our nutritional health and not expect the government to do that for us, because the government is failing.
Well, Doc, I think it's clear that you are leading this revolution. You are perhaps one of the most well-read individuals I have ever spoken with in my entire life. You have forgotten more than I will ever know. And it has just been a true delight getting the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Thanks for watching. If you got value out of this video, please like it, subscribe, and hit the notification button to see our next